You wake up on a Tuesday morning and nothing about your life seems unusual. The alarm goes off, coffee gets made, and emails start arriving before you even finish breakfast. You get in the car, drive to work, and begin another day that looks almost identical to the one before it. From the outside, your life looks stable, maybe even successful. You have a steady job. Your partner has a steady job. The bills get paid, the house is decent, the cars run, and you're not struggling in the way people usually imagine when they hear the word broke. But there's a quiet tension that never really leaves. Because even though the income looks good on paper, the feeling of security never quite arrives. There's always something that keeps you slightly on edge. A repair, a medical bill, a school expense, a price increase you didn't expect. None of these things are catastrophic. They're just enough to remind you that things are tighter than they should be. And that's the confusing part, because you did everything right. You worked hard, built a career, made responsible decisions, and avoided reckless financial choices. In theory, this should be the stage of life where things start to feel easier. Instead, it feels like you're running a system that can never stop. 2 incomes come in every month, but somehow both of them are already spoken for before the month even begins. Housing, insurance, food, transportation, childcare, utilities, taxes. The list isn't extravagant, it's just constant. And every time one of those costs rises a little, the margin shrinks a little. Which leads to a question most people rarely say out loud. If 2 incomes are supposed to make life more secure, why does everything suddenly feel fragile the moment one of them disappears? Now here's where things start to get interesting, because the problem most people think they're dealing with isn't actually the real problem. Most couples assume the issue is simple. Life got expensive, salaries didn't keep up, and the cost of living just keeps rising. And while that explanation sounds reasonable, it doesn't fully explain the strange tensions so many dual-income households feel today. The deeper issue is that modern life quietly reorganized itself around the assumption that both incomes will always exist. Think about how the biggest financial decisions in a household are made. When a family applies for a mortgage, the bank doesn't evaluate one person's salary. It evaluates the combined household income. 2 paychecks get added together, and that larger number determines what the family qualifies for. On paper, this feels like progress. 2 incomes mean access to a better neighborhood, a larger home, and opportunities that might not have been possible before. But something subtle happens the moment that larger number becomes the foundation of the decision. The house is no longer sized for 1 income with breathing room. It's sized for 2 incomes functioning perfectly every single month. And once that decision is made, an entire chain reaction begins. The location determines the commute. The commute determines transportation costs. The neighborhood influences taxes, insurance, and everyday expenses. Over time, the entire lifestyle grows to match the income that made it possible in the first place. Another subtle shift happens when financial institutions begin treating 2 incomes as the default. When lenders evaluate a household, they aren't asking whether a family could survive on 1 paycheck. They're calculating what the household can theoretically sustain with both incomes working at full capacity. That calculation becomes the new baseline for loans, mortgages, and long-term commitments. Over time, this changes the way families make decisions. Instead of asking, "What could we comfortably afford on 1 income?" the question quietly becomes, "What can we qualify for together?" Those 2 questions sound similar, but they lead to very different outcomes. The first leaves room for uncertainty. The second assumes stability. And when enough households begin making decisions based on the larger number, the entire system adjusts around it. Prices rise to meet the maximum capacity of the market. Opportunities become tied to those higher price points. Eventually, the combined income that once looked like an advantage becomes the minimum requirement just to enter the game. But housing isn't the only mechanism quietly reshaping the financial structure of modern households. There's another force at work that most families never notice until it's already happened. Markets respond to purchasing power. When millions of households suddenly have access to 2 incomes instead of 1, the maximum price people can pay begins to change. And when the maximum price changes, markets adapt to it. Housing adjusts, services adjust, Entire industries gradually calibrate themselves around the purchasing power of dual-income households. No one coordinates this process. It simply emerges from the behavior of the market itself. If enough buyers can technically afford something, that price slowly becomes the new normal. And this leads to a quiet escalation. Families aren't necessarily chasing luxury. Most are simply trying to access the same basic things every other family wants. A safe place to live, decent schools, reliable transportation, a comfortable home. But when everyone is bidding with two incomes instead of one, the price of those ordinary things slowly rises until two incomes are required just to participate. Here's the strange part most people never calculate. When the structure of life expands to absorb both incomes, the second income often stops behaving like extra money. It becomes the cost of maintaining the system itself. In other words, instead of giving the household more freedom, it simply allows the household to sustain a more expensive version of normal life. The income grew, but the baseline grew with it. And then there's another mechanism hiding underneath all of this, and it has less to do with money and more to do with time. When both adults in a household work full schedules, time becomes one of the scarcest resources in the system. The day starts early, ends late, and most of the hours in between are already committed. Commuting, meetings, deadlines, school schedules, errands. The margin in the day shrinks, just like the margin in the budget. And when time disappears, the household starts solving problems differently. Tasks that once happened inside the home slowly move outside of it. Meals become convenience. Cleaning becomes a service. Small repairs get outsourced. Groceries become delivery. Weekends become recovery instead of productivity. None of these choices feel irresponsible. In fact, they feel completely reasonable. After a long workday, saving an hour of effort can feel like a small victory. But together, those small decisions quietly reshape the cost structure of everyday life. Now step back and look at the structure that has been built. The mortgage assumes two incomes. The transportation assumes two incomes. The daily routines assume two incomes. Every major piece of the system now depends on both paychecks continuing without interruption. And that's the hidden mechanism behind the tension so many households feel but struggle to explain. From the outside, it looks like financial strength. Two careers, two paychecks, a solid household income. But underneath that surface, the structure now runs at full capacity. Because if either side of the system stops, even temporarily, the margin that once might have existed simply isn't there anymore. The income didn't fail. The system simply grew until it needed all of it just to keep moving. At some point, people begin to sense this pattern in their own lives, even if they can't immediately explain it. It doesn't usually arrive as a dramatic realization. It shows up in smaller moments. A quiet thought while reviewing the monthly bills. A conversation late at night about whether things actually feel easier than they used to. Or that subtle feeling of pressure that never fully disappears, even during the good months. Because when you step back and look at the structure of the household, something becomes clear. Almost everything depends on the system continuing exactly the way it is right now. The schedules are tight, the obligations are fixed, the commitments stretch months and years into the future. And slowly you start to notice that the financial plan you thought you had isn't really a plan at all. It's more like a balance that has to be maintained. Most families didn't design it this way intentionally. The decisions that built this structure usually made sense at the time. A slightly larger home because both incomes made it affordable. A neighborhood chosen for better schools. Reliable transportation for two careers that depend on showing up every day. None of these choices feel reckless. In fact, they often feel responsible. Each one seems like the logical next step for a family trying to build stability. But over time, those logical steps stack on top of each other until the structure becomes surprisingly rigid. The household starts to depend on continuity more than growth. As long as both incomes continue, the system works. The bills get paid, the routines stay intact, and life moves forward. But the moment you imagine changing something, the tension becomes obvious. What if one person wanted to step back from work for a while? What if a job suddenly became unstable? What if life demanded time somewhere else with children, parents, or health? Even thinking about those possibilities can make the entire financial structure feel fragile. Not because the income is small, but because everything around that income has been built to assume it will always be there. And that realization can be strangely uncomfortable, because when people feel financial pressure, the natural instinct is to blame themselves. Maybe we spent too much. Maybe we didn't save enough. Maybe we made the wrong decisions along the way. But when you look closely at the pattern, something different becomes visible. Many families who feel this pressure didn't get there through reckless spending or poor judgment. They got there by following the normal path that modern life laid out for them. They pursued stable careers. They built households around opportunity. They tried to give their families security. In other words, they did exactly what they were told responsible adults should do. Which is why the feeling can be so confusing. On paper, everything looks like progress. 2 incomes, a comfortable home, a busy and productive life. Yet underneath it all, there's that lingering question that keeps returning every time something unexpected happens. If everything in this system depends on both incomes continuing exactly the way they are today, how secure is it really? And this is the moment where the way most people think about the problem begins to change, because the real issue is never simply about how many incomes a household has. 2 incomes can absolutely create opportunity. They can accelerate savings, open doors, and make life more comfortable. The problem begins when those incomes stop being a choice and quietly become a requirement. For many households, the second income originally represented extra capacity. It was the margin that could be saved, invested, or used to move the family forward faster. But over time, that extra capacity slowly gets absorbed by the structure of everyday life. A slightly larger home because the combined income made it possible. A neighborhood chosen for opportunity. Commitments that seemed reasonable because the numbers worked. None of those decisions feel extreme. In fact, they often feel responsible. But when enough of them stack together, something subtle happens. The second income stops expanding your options and starts maintaining the structure you've already built. And this is where the definition of financial strength quietly becomes misleading. When people see a household with 2 solid incomes, they assume stability. On paper, it looks powerful, but strength in any system doesn't come from how much energy flows through it. It comes from how much pressure the system can absorb when something changes. A structure that requires 2 incomes to function has less resilience than one that can operate on one, because resilience comes from unused capacity. The same principle exists everywhere else in complex systems. Bridges are designed to carry more weight than they normally hold. Power grids are built with excess capacity in case demand spikes. Airplanes are engineered with backup systems in case something fails. But many households unintentionally build financial structures that operate at full capacity all the time. Every paycheck already has a job. Every expense already has a place. Every commitment assumes the current system will continue exactly as it is. And systems that run at full capacity tend to look perfectly stable right up until the moment something interrupts them. This is the twist most people eventually realize. Financial security doesn't come from the size of the income flowing through a household. It comes from the distance between what a household earns and what it needs just to keep functioning. That distance is margin. When margin exists, a family has flexibility. A career can change direction. One partner can step back if life demands it. Unexpected events become problems to solve instead of immediate crises. But when the structure of life expands until it consumes both incomes completely, that margin disappears. And once the margin disappears, even a strong income can begin to feel fragile because now the system depends on continuity. The jobs must continue. The schedules must hold. The paychecks must keep arriving exactly the way they always have. The irony is that the second income, which once represented flexibility, can slowly erase that flexibility if the structure of life grows large enough around it. And that's when the trap finally becomes visible. It was never really about whether a household has 1 income or 2. It was about whether the structure of life leaves any room at all when something changes. Once you see that, the conversation about money starts to change. Most financial advice focuses on increasing income, finding better investments, or optimizing small details in the budget. Those things can matter, but they're not really addressing the deeper issue that many households are facing. The real question isn't simply how much money is coming in. The real question is how much flexibility exists inside the system you've built around that income. Because flexibility is what turns income into security. It's what allows a family to absorb change without everything collapsing at once. When there's room in the structure, a job loss becomes a challenge to solve instead of a crisis. A health issue becomes something the family can adapt to rather than something that immediately threatens the household. That's the part many people lost without realizing it. Somewhere along the way, modern life traded flexibility for scale. Bigger houses, more commitments, more financial obligations that assume life will keep moving in a straight line. As long as everything continues exactly as planned, the system works. But the moment life shifts even slightly, the lack of margin becomes visible. The households that eventually regain a sense of security usually don't do it by dramatically increasing their income. What they do instead is protect their margin. They structure their lives in a way that keeps some room between what they earn and what their life requires. That space becomes the real source of stability. It creates the freedom to make decisions instead of reacting to pressure. Because in the end, financial security isn't really about the number of paychecks in a household. It's about whether the structure of life gives you options when something changes. And once you start looking at money through that lens, a different question begins to matter more than any salary number ever could. Not how much do we earn, but how much room do we actually have?